what if Clash Royale never added a single air card? No minions, no Lava Hound, no Balloon. From day one, every battle would have been a brutal ground-only war. No flying distractions, no aerial threats, just pure, unforgiving melee. Sparky might have ruled the meta. Hog Rider would be unstoppable. Lavaloon? Never existed. Entire strategies erased. But would the game have been more balanced? Or just boring? Let's go back to 2016 and imagine a Clash Royale where nothing ever left the ground. Let's start at the very beginning. January 4th, 2016. Clash Royale had just entered its soft launch beta. The fundamentals were there: Elixir, 2 separate lanes, spells, and towers. But no metas had really formed yet. Players were still figuring out what worked and what didn't. Some cards were absurdly strong and underused, while others dominated purely because people hadn't learned how to counter them yet. Now imagine if, in this raw, formative version of the game, air cards simply didn't exist. We're talking no baby dragon, no minions, no minion horde, and no balloon. These 4 cards, they mattered, and their absence would have dramatically reshaped how players learned and built decks during those 2 crucial months of the beta. Let's start with the most impactful one, that being Minion Horde. In beta, minions themselves were rarely used, sitting at around a 6% usage rate, but Minion Horde, now that card, was everywhere. A whopping 50% usage rate in top ladder. Half the players were running it, and for good reason. It was fast, brutal, and could shred through just about anything if you didn't have the perfect counter ready. It punished slow pushes, melted tanks, and demanded a response. Now delete that card. All of a sudden, tank units like Giant and P.E.K.K.A get a lot more breathing room. One of the 4 reliable tank shredders in the beta is now gone. That only leaves the Skeleton Army, Barbarians, and Inferno Tower. All 3 of those are ground-based, which means that tanks can now be built around more confidently with fewer hard counters in circulation. Giant could have emerged as an even stronger win condition, and P.E.K.K.A might have seen a small rise too, especially since she was already terrifying in open space. Though in the first few weeks of the beta, the P.E.K.K.A still cost 8 elixir with only slightly more hit points, so maybe she would have still been useless. But after a few weeks, cards like Giant, P.E.K.K.A and Golem could become a lot more threatening without a swarm of minions attacking from above. Honestly, what do the minions even throw? I used to think it was rocks, but it turns out they throw dark elixir. So you learn something new every day, I guess. But things are just getting started, because if removing Minion Horde shook things up, wait until we delete a real flying win condition, a card that defined entire strategies and forced players into chaos. Let's talk about the Balloon. The Balloon also had a noteworthy presence in the beta, sitting at a 14% usage rate. It was the only flying win condition at the time, and while not as dominant as Hog Rider or Expo, the 2 most popular win conditions, Balloon plus Freeze was a very real threat. But let's be honest, Freeze made anything scary in the beta. It wasn't that Balloon was broken, it was that Freeze was broken and just enabled this shenanigan. Still though, without Balloon, the entire vertical pressure dynamic is erased. Defending becomes purely a horizontal game, and that changes a lot. Towers don't have to split their attention between ground and air. A building like Tesla loses its unique identity since its ability to hit air is no longer relevant. Bomb tower or cannon would be a much better choice as they can only target ground troops anyway. And fun fact, Expo actually used to target air in the beta. It was like the modern day Expo, but with anti-air built in. Removing air cards would make this feel oddly normal from the start. In a way, Clash Royale without air would have pushed the game toward a weirdly simplified version of what we have today, where interactions are flatter and decks are a lot more predictable. But if you think that's where the madness ends, oh no, because next is a card that never seemed broken, never really seemed unfair, but take away air units and suddenly the entire game shifts around it. let's talk about the Baby Dragon. Baby Dragon is sitting at a 15% usage rate, not super common, but also not ignored. It was one of those safe support cards, cost-effective, splashy, and hard to fully counter without air-targeting troops. The Baby Dragon could safely splash at cards like Barbarians without taking any damage itself, and unlike Bomber or Wizard, it couldn't be spelled away as easily. And for only that 4 elixir, it filled a niche that made sense in mixed decks. Without it, that niche kinda disappears. Now consider the Wizard, who was extremely valuable in the beta, not because of his synergy with ground troops, but because of his ability to obliterate Minion Horde. He was practically mandatory in some decks because of how dominant that card was. Take out air units, especially Minion Horde, and suddenly Wizard becomes, well, a worse bomber. He still does splash damage, but now he costs 3 more elixir than the bomber to hit mostly the same targets. That is a major efficiency drop, and it ripples throughout the meta. Players would start ditching the Wizard in favor of lower cost splash options, and we might have seen Bomber rise earlier than it did historically. The removal of air cards also would affect spell dynamics. While arrows were very strong in the beta, largely thanks to how effectively they countered the Minion Horde, they would have taken a major hit. Yes, they still hit Skarmy and Goblin swarms, but with no minions or Horde, their elixir value drops hard. Zap, on the other hand, starts to look phenomenal. Back in the beta, Zap could one-shot goblins, kill spear goblins, and skeletons instantly, and it was only 2 elixir. It was faster, cheaper, and more flexible. In a grounded world with no flying swarms, Zap might have become the default swarm clearer way earlier in the game's evolution, and arrows might have faded out entirely. Fireball would have remained relevant either way, with or without air units, simply because of how well it handled the ground threats like Barbarians, Musketeer, and Wizard. But all this leads to a single question that might redefine how we think about game design. If Clash Royale never had air cards to begin with, would we even really miss them? So, where does this question lead us? Would a beta with no air cards have been better, cleaner, more balanced? Well, before I give you an answer to those questions, I'd like to ask you really quick to consider subscribing. These videos take tons of effort to research, script, and edit, and voice, and blah, 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 but your support really does mean the world to me. I would really appreciate it. Anyway, back to answering that question. Would a beta with no air cards have been better or maybe more balanced? Well, not really. The game would have been easier to learn, sure, there would have been less overwhelming things for new players, no need to keep an air counter in every deck, but it also would have gone stale pretty fast. With only ground units, you lose a huge layer of depth. There's no verticality to worry about, no decks that sneak over your defenses, no sudden panic when a balloon drifts its way over to your tower. You lose the unpredictability that makes Clash Royale, well, Clash Royale. In a way, it's like removing rock from rock, paper, scissors. Sure, you still have interactions, but that triangle falls apart. It becomes binary. And binary is boring. Now, would Supercell have noticed this themselves? Probably. The devs were not blind. The second air cards were removed, or never existed, they likely would have seen the lack of diversity in decks, the drop in ranged splash value, the imbalance in tower defenses, and the overwhelming dominance of cheap ground spam or heavy pushes. In fact, they probably would have added air cards quickly just to introduce variety and vertical pressure. And I assume this is what happened during the testing phase of the game. But players during the beta, yeah, they were still learning. Busted cards like skeletons at a 4% usage rate because no one really knew how good they were, so maybe, just maybe, no one would have even noticed that something was missing. Or at least not right away. But the second the game launched globally, things would change fast. And without air cards, Clash Royale might have flown too close to the ground and never really taken off. But here is where it gets interesting. Right before going global, Supercell dropped a bombshell of an update. It was meant to reshape the entire game, introduce legendaries, redefine balance, and set the tone for millions of new players. But in our version of Clash Royale, that entire plan would backfire. Let's break down why. On February 29th, 2016, just days before Clash Royale went global, Supercell dropped a massive update. It introduced the first legendary cards, Princess and Ice Wizard, as well as Royal Giant, Dark Prince, Poison, and 3 Musketeers. It was a huge moment. These weren't just random additions, they were meant to reshape the game before it exploded worldwide. But if air cards never existed, this update would have hit very differently. See, cards like Princess, Ice Wizard, Three Musketeers, and Poison all share something very important. They can target air, and it's not just a bonus feature, it's baked into their cost. When a card can cover both ground and sky, that flexibility adds elixir tax. It's why Ice Wizard costs 3 elixir and not 2, and the same goes for every other card that can hit air. So if flying troops didn't exist, that flexibility kinda becomes worthless. These cards still offer value, yes, but they're suddenly overpaying for something they'll never need to do. The Princess can still outrange towers, Ice Wizard still slows everything down, but they are no longer as overpowered as before. The same goes for Three Musketeers. Their air coverage is what justifies the risk of the, well, then 10 elixir. Remove that and you're just paying for damage split across the map. And this isn't just a one-time thing, it's a pattern that'll stick for the rest of the video. Any card that targets air is inherently overpriced when air cards don't exist. That simple truth will kind of ripple through every meta, every update, and every balance patch. All because a whole dimension of the game is, well, just kinda gone. While it is true that not being able to hit air makes them less efficient for their cost, it doesn't really matter, since there are no air units to worry about in the first place. I mean, duh, you read the title of the video and have watched this far. So on May 3rd, 2016, Clash Royale introduced several game-changing cards. Sparky, Miner, Guards, Furnace, and Fire Spirits. But in this airless world, the Lava Hound, one of Clash Royale's most iconic cards, was missing. This absence wouldn't just be a small tweak, it would completely erase an entire archetype that would go on to define competitive play for years. Lavaloon. The deadly combo of a Lava Hound and Balloon relies on the Lava Hound acting as a massive flying tank, soaking up damage from towers and ground units while the Balloon bombs away. Without the Lava Hound, this entire strategy collapses, and, well, the Balloon also isn't in the picture. This absence removes one of the game's most popular and fearsome aerial win conditions, forcing the meta to become far more ground-focused. Players would rely more heavily on Hog Rider, X-Bow, or Giant pushes, and the rich aerial dimension that defined so many matches simply vanishes. At the same time, Sparky kinda benefits from this shift. Normally, one of Sparky's biggest counters include Minions and Minion Horde, air troops that can shred her before she fires. But with no air cards, Sparky faces fewer threats, making her devastating charge harder to stop. This, combined with the fact that Electro Wizard hasn't been introduced yet, means Sparky could dominate more easily in ground-only matchups. Other new cards like Miner, Guards, Furnace, and Fire Spirits slot in smoothly, focusing on ground control and chip damage. The Furnace's Fire Spirits lose some of their impact without air troops to pressure, but still provide valuable ground area denial. Miner remains a versatile tool for surprise damage and chip unaffected by the absence of air, and overall, without the Lava Hound, Clash Royale's early meta loses one of its most explosive and dynamic archetypes. While cards like Sparky gain strength in a ground-centric battlefield, the game would feel heavier, slower, and far less diverse in strategy. In July 2016, Clash Royale introduced several new cards: Bowler, Lumberjack, Ice Spirit, and Log. And in a world without air cards, 2 of these stand out, Bowler and Log, for how drastically their roles shift. The Bowler's signature move is rolling a huge boulder that crushes everything in its path on the ground, knocking back troops and clearing swarms. Normally, his biggest weakness is air units, especially minions. He simply can't target them, and even though he's got a solid amount of hit points, he's quite slow, so the minions can whittle down his hit points fairly easily. So with no air cards at all, that threat completely disappears. The Bowler no longer has to worry about being overwhelmed by cheap flying units. Without minions flying overhead, he becomes much tougher to counter. His durability and control over ground troops make him a much more reliable force, both defensively and offensively. This change would elevate the Bowler's value significantly. Players would also lean on him more, knowing that one of his biggest counters simply doesn't exist. While ground swarms like Skeleton Army and Goblin Gang still pose challenges, none have the same speed or aerial immunity that minions brought. and the Wizard would become nearly useless. The Bowler and Wizard both cost 5 elixir, but in a world without air cards, what is the downside of the Bowler and what's the advantage of the Wizard? Bowler has way more survivability, and his Boulder can roll further than the Wizard's Fireball travels. The log also arrives in July. In the real game, the log's inability to hit air is a major drawback, since it can't clear out dangerous flying swarms, but in this airless universe, that weakness simply disappears. Despite this, the log wasn't yet a meta-defining card back in 2016. It was still considered unbelievably weak compared to spells like Arrows and Zap, and hadn't really found its footing. However, without the need to worry about air units, the log's ground clearing ability and knockback started to become more valuable. This update sets up the log for a future rise, where it'll shine in a meta stripped of aerial threats. For now though, it is a sleeper, quietly waiting for the right moment to become essential. The Lumberjack and Ice Spirit were also added in this patch. Both brought aggressive utility, Lumberjack with his speed and rage effect, and Ice Spirit with his freeze ability, but neither was directly affected by the absence of air troops. Their roles remained consistent, but they didn't shift the meta the way the Bowler and Log did in this air-focused context. July of 2016 marks a significant shift toward ground-centric gameplay. The Bowler becomes a much stronger and more reliable force without airborne counters, while the Log waits for some buffs and reworks to become a true competitor. Players would adapt, leaning into cards like Bowler to dominate the battlefield, and ground swarms would have a lot of trouble existing. Heavier units that pack a big punch would see more play. Think of the Prince and P.E.K.K.A, but keep watching because the next few months are where it all explodes. In the real Clash Royale timeline, September of 2016 marked the rise of one of the most dominant archetypes in the game's early history: Giant Poison. It was a deck that warped the meta, controlled the pace of games, and turned Giant from a simple tank into an oppressive win condition. That month, 4 cards were introduced: Mega Minion, Inferno Dragon, Graveyard, and Ice Golem, but in our airless version of Clash Royale, 2 of those cards just wouldn't exist. That being Mega Minion and Inferno Dragon, both air units, they'd simply be gone, and that has some huge implications. See, Mega Minion was so powerful during this period that it earned the nickname Meta Minion. It was cheap, tanky, hard to counter, and could be placed safely in the backline to support pushes. Behind a Giant, it provided brutal single target damage while being incredibly resistant to spells like Zap or Arrows. And without it, Giant Poison decks are missing one of their most efficient support troops. Players would likely fill that gap with ground units like Dark Prince, Lumberjack, or Mini P.E.K.K.A, but none of them provide quite the same mix of safety and damage per cost. The deck would still work, but it wouldn't be as clean or efficient. Now, here's the kicker. Inferno Dragon, one of the few scalable tank counters in the game, never arrives. This is monumental for Giant Golem and even Royal Giant players. Without this flying laser cannon melting your tank and with no other air threats to force out counters, tanks are freer than ever to just stomp down the lane. Sure, you still have the Inferno Tower, Barbarians, and Mini P.E.K.K.A, but there are issues. This same update gave Lightning the ability to reset Inferno Tower, meaning you could now counter one of the last reliable tank killers by zapping it out of its charge. Zap could have already done the job too, and ground-based counters like Barbarians were vulnerable to splashers like Bowler, who, remember, got a lot stronger when Minions and Minion Horde vanished. So Giant not only loses a major threat in Inferno Dragon, but also finds himself in a meta where most of his counters are less consistent than ever. Let's not forget what really pushed Giant over the top: Poison. At this point in time, Poison was downright oppressive. It lasted 10 seconds, covered a huge area, slowed movement and attack speed, and dealt constant damage. It was perfect for stacking with a Giant push. If your opponent dropped defending troops, they either had to walk through Poison and slowly melt, or avoid the Giant entirely. The synergy was overwhelming. Drop a Giant at the bridge, place Poison on top of the defending side of the map, and watch everything crumble under the pressure. Without fast burst troops like Minion Horde to quickly clean up the Giant, or strong single target damage like Inferno Dragon to burn him down, defending was a nightmare. The airless version of Clash Royale only amplifies this problem. Defenders are more limited, counters are more fragile, and Poison has even fewer things that can play outside of its radius. The same update also brought in Graveyard and Ice Golem. Graveyard would likely work very well with Giant. Giant plus Graveyard would be a terrifying combo in this world, especially when defenders are being slowed and chipped down by Poison while random skeletons pile onto their tower. Ice Golem, meanwhile, is still a fantastic mini-tank and distraction unit. It loses some of its utility since it can't kite air troops anymore, but it's still amazing at kiting units like Valkyrie or Knight, absorbing damage and buying time for defenses to regroup. Without Mega Minion to support, Giant Poison loses a bit of finesse, but without Inferno Dragon to counter, it kinda becomes even more unstoppable. And with Poison at its most broken, this version of Clash Royale turns into a slow, grinding war of control, where one wrong step into Poison Mist means the end of your tower. And remember that log from before? Yeah, it's now gotten buffed, reworked, and is absolutely gonna dominate this meta. It'll hit every single card in the opponent's deck, dealing knockback and damage, and also giving some solid control. Air didn't just die, it took balance with it. But you know what, let's fast forward a bit. The upcoming months we would get some new cards including Elite Barbarians and Electro Wizard, but no air cards or anything really worth mentioning. The final update in 2016 brings us some new cards yet again, including the Executioner, which in this world is literally just a worse bowler, so, you know, Execution and Wizard would likely never see the light of day. But you best keep watching, because when we start talking about evolutions, it just completely flips the script. But for now, we arrive in 2017. Between December of 2016 and May of 2017, Clash Royale went a little dry, not nearly as regular card drops as before, and for a live service game that had just exploded globally, that's kinda crazy. The community was hungry, desperate for something to shake up the game. And then May of 2017 hits, and Supercell delivers. In one batch, we got the heal spell, the Bandit, the Night Witch, and the Bats. And if you know your Clash Royale history, your brain probably will light up with this one phrase: Golem, Night Witch, Beatdown. This deck was an absolute monster. It became one of the most dominant win conditions Clash Royale had ever seen. Golem up the back, Night Witch right behind, and from there it just snowballed. She would spawn bats constantly, clogging the air, chipping away at everything. Add in a baby dragon for splash support, and suddenly you have an unstoppable push rolling straight toward the enemy tower. It defined the meta, and it wasn't just strong, it was relentless. It was... But hold on. This isn't possible, because remember, this is a world with no air cards. There's no baby dragon to splash away swarms, there are no bats to swarm the tower, and without them, that synergy that made Golem Night Witch so oppressive just doesn't even exist. Sure, Night Witch is still in the game, she's not a flying troop herself, but let's be honest, her entire identity was never about her melee damage. Her true value came from those bats. They pressured opponents, demanded spells, forced awkward responses, and filled the air with non-stop chip damage. Without them, she's just kinda weird. A melee unit with okay DPS and a strange death spawn effect, but even that doesn't matter because there are no bats to spawn when she dies. She's not a Night Witch anymore, she's just a witch with an identity crisis, like a necromancer who picked up a mace. And just like that, one of Clash Royale's most iconic archetypes gets erased from history. Not because the Golem got nerfed, not because the meta shifted, but because one more mechanic, air cards, simply doesn't exist. And Night Witch isn't the only one who suffers. Let's talk about the bats themselves for a moment. They were some of the most elixir-efficient units in the game. 2 elixir for 5 flying troops with decent DPS. That was insane value. They played a huge role in defense, bait decks, and cycle control. Their absence doesn't just nerf Night Witch, it nerfs the entire ecosystem of cheap defensive responses, especially to cards like Miner, Valkyrie, and Graveyard. But Night Witch and Bats weren't the only cards added this update. Let's take a second to talk about the heal spell. It wasn't great back then, and it wouldn't magically be better now. Heal was almost always used in tandem with swarmy support pushes or 3 Musketeers, but I have a feeling that 3 Musketeers won't see a lot of use with no air cards in the mix. Then there's the Bandit, and surprisingly, she's kinda chill. The Bandit wasn't introduced to counter air, she was introduced to dash through defenses and pressure the bridge. She'd still do that just fine. She might have a little more trouble as she'll get distracted easier, but you know, nothing crazy. So yeah, May 2017 gives us 4 new cards and a completely new meta, but in this alternate timeline, everything plays out differently. Night Witch becomes forgettable, Heal becomes useless, Bats never existed, and Golem Beatdown loses one of its most legendary forms. Because this is not the Clash Royale you remember. This is the version where air was never part of the game. And this also means that the next update of 4 cards will actually be an update of 2 cards, but not just any 2 cards. Because yeah, the Flying Machine and Skeleton Barrel, those 2 never even make it to the battlefield. The Flying Machine literally has flying in its name, like, come on, this wasn't even up for debate. And the Skeleton Barrel, same story. No flying means no floating barrel, no sneaky death drop skeletons, no bait value, nothing. Gone. So that leaves us with just 2 cards to talk about, Mega Knight and Cannon Card. But in a Clash Royale without air cards, would they break the game or just fade into irrelevance? Would this be their moment to dominate or a recipe for disaster? Let's find out, starting with the Mega Knight. In normal Clash Royale, one of his biggest weaknesses was pretty straightforward. Air cards. He was expensive, and he had no way to hit anything above ground, and could be absolutely shredded by things like minions, bats, or a properly placed Inferno dragon. His spawn damage might be brutal, but if your opponent could get air troops on top of him, well, good luck getting any real value. I know I'm making him sound like a pretty weak troop in the original game, but even then he was already terrorizing the arena. But here, oh boy, he is feasting. Without air units, every troop is targetable. That spawn damage, it is guaranteed. There is no scenario where you drop a Mega Knight and it doesn't immediately crush something. And the support cards that would normally melt him from the sky, those are gone. He's suddenly reliable. Still expensive, still a commitment, sure, but at least you know he's still going to connect, stomp, and clear a path like a true tanky bruiser would. And then there's the Cannon Card. Arguably one of the most underrated winners of this update. Normally one of the Cannon Card's biggest weaknesses is its vulnerability to air cards. Now for just 1 more elixir than a musketeer, you get a high DPS, high health, ground-only machine that rolls up like a mini tank and sticks around like a building when it dies. Oh, and because it can't be picked off from the air, its uptime skyrockets. It becomes this versatile hybrid, part support, part defense, part win condition in the right decks. Suddenly, it's not just that one weird card with a shield, it's must-include material in control decks, bridge spam, or even beatdown. So yeah, July 2017 might have looked like a 4-card update on paper, but in this version of Clash Royale, it is a 2-card meta shift, and both of those cards, they just get a whole lot better. From this point forward, card releases would slow down a lot. They would get less frequent, and when they did drop, it would be with less cards each time. The main cards that we see losing value would be the Zappies, Hunter, and Magic Archer, considering, you know, they all target air, with the Hunter in particular losing a lot of its value. Being able to shut down Balloon was incredible, but he's also quite fragile, so now he's kind of like a ranged mini P.E.K.K.A, not really great. Zappies can still see some value, and Magic Archer can still get a bunch of damage with the right geometry. But just when you thought the dust had settled, it gets worse. With fewer cards releasing and more air-focused designs getting stripped of their purpose, Clash Royale kinda starts to change. Cards start to feel incomplete. Roles get blurred and entire strategies vanish before they even have a chance to evolve. And what's coming in 2018? Well, some of the most forgettable cards in the game's history. Made even worse in a world where the skies are silent. Let's talk about what happens when the air is gone and the creativity starts to suffer. In April of 2018, we would see the introduction of the Rascals, a card that never really had a solid place in the meta. Sure, they were annoying in bait decks or for clogging up a lane, but they were never essential. And in this alternate version of Clash Royale, yeah, they're kinda even less relevant. The Rascal Girls were designed to be a cheap ranged air targeting support. With no air cards in the game, that core part of their functionality kinda becomes worthless. You're left with 2 underwhelming archers backing up a tanky boy who only gets value in niche situations. Not exactly meta defining. Later that summer, we got a burst of Royal-themed additions with the Royal Recruits, Royal Hogs, and Giant Snowball. In regular Clash Royale, Royal Hogs helped shape entire metas, especially when combined with Royal Recruits and flying support troops like the Flying Machine. But here, you know, they're still decent. After all, they're just fast ground attackers that split lanes and pressure, but they lose a lot of synergy options without aerial backup. Royal Recruits, on the other hand, might actually be better in this world. 6 bodies covering both lanes is always annoying to deal with, and without air counters like Baby Dragon or Flying Machine to sweep them off the board, they can clog and stall even harder. though the bowler will be a tough counter for them. As for the giant snowball, it would still have its uses. Slowing down ground swarms or resetting charges is helpful, and since it's cheap and disruptive, it fits well into control decks. But let's be real, part of what made Snowball so valuable in Clash Royale was its interaction with units like Minions and Bats. Unfortunately, that part of its identity is completely gone here. In September, the Goblin Giant joins the roster. Normally, he serves as a tanky body that distracts while the Spear Goblins on his back poke away at both air and ground. But again, no air. He's not useless by any means, but his extra utility is definitely dulled. He becomes more of a budget giant with some bonus chip damage rather than a versatile threat. Then in November, the Electro Dragon makes his debut, but yeah, not in this timeline. It's a dragon that flies. That's an instant DQ. What made it so special, its chain lightning across any troop, relied heavily on hitting aerial units stacked behind tanks. With no air, it's a flying spark machine that can't even be placed. It doesn't exist. And to round out the year, we've got the Ram Rider in December. Now this one is actually pretty interesting. Ram Rider is ground-based and targets buildings, meaning she does work here, but her main draw is her ability to slow down all troop types, including air. And while her snare mechanic is still valuable, it's not as impactful when all of the air units are missing from the game. That said, her path-blocking, tower-locking charge attack can still be scary, and she could definitely find a spot in some bridge spam decks. So yeah, 2018 still brings some new tools and variety, but many of these cards lose key parts of their identity or, vanish altogether thanks to one simple rule. Air is gone, and those effects keep on stacking. And then comes 2019, and with it, one of the most underrated but quietly terrifying spells in this alternate Clash Royale. Earthquake. When Earthquake first dropped, it was mostly seen as a niche counter to buildings, ideal for slowly melting down structures while supporting a win condition like Hog or Royal Hogs. But part of what held it back in Clash Royale was its complete inability to touch air troops. Bats, Minions, Lava Pups, these would survive and counter-push while your Earthquake just rumbled the ground and hoped for the best. But in a world with no air units, suddenly that downside just doesn't exist anymore. Just like the log, which always had the can't hit air asterisk next to it, an asterisk that gets erased in this timeline, Earthquake gets a massive indirect buff. Its limited targeting was its main drawback, but now it's one of the most elixir-efficient control spells in the game. You're dealing constant chip damage, slowing down movement and attack speed, and destroying buildings, all without worrying about flying troops dodging it. Pair that with units like Royal Hogs, Ram Rider, or even Giant, and you've got a deck that can consistently wear down defenses and win the battle of attrition. And unlike Fireball or Poison, Earthquake is cheaper, faster, and allows for more aggressive pushes. In this timeline, Earthquake doesn't just fill a niche, it becomes a staple. But keep watching because it's gonna get even crazier. 2020 arrives, and in the real world, we'd see the release of Skeleton Dragons, but not here. They didn't have a huge impact other than some Fireball bait decks and Mortar decks when they first came out, so their absence doesn't change a lot for 2020. But one card that does make the cut is the Electro Giant. Now, here's the thing. E-Giant is one of the few cards whose value stays pretty much the same. His whole gimmick is punishing anything that dares hit him. He reflects damage back and keeps marching forward. In the normal game, he might have been scared of Minions or Bats chipping away at him, but those cards never existed here. So he doesn't gain any new strengths, he just never had those weaknesses to begin with. There's also no Inferno Dragon to melt him from a distance, which definitely makes him a bit more reliable in pushing through heavier defenses. But still, Mini P.E.K.K.A, Prince, and P.E.K.K.A are all still around, and buildings still exist, even if Earthquake and Lightning are making sure those crumble fast. So Electro Giant doesn't get a buff or a nerf in this world, he just kinda arrives, and he works. No better, maybe a little worse, but still just a steady, grounded menace. But we're not done yet, because just as players start adjusting to that grounded meta, Clash Royale drops something that changes everything. 2021 brought us the Goblin Drill, a card designed to surprise and pressure from underground. In the real game, it's a tricky card because it spawns goblins directly onto the enemy's territory, forcing quick reactions. But in this airless alternate universe, the Goblin Drill's threat level takes a serious hit. Without air cards, the Drill's goblins become very easy prey for splash and area damage units like Bowler, Valkyrie, and Dark Prince, all of whom excel at wiping out small groups of grounded troops. These counters make the Drill's surprise element far less potent. So where does that leave us? The Drill quickly fades into the background here because 2021's biggest shape-up was the Champions update, a massive overhaul introducing powerful new units with unique abilities. This update could have dramatically changed the landscape in this no-air timeline. The Archer Queen, who normally has a really easy time dealing with air cards, part of what makes her so strong, would lose some of her edge without any flying support. Without air cards, the champion update would tilt the game even further toward ground dominance, potentially making champions the centerpiece of every deck. The Golden Knight could chain onto troops easier as, well, all troops are ground troops. The Champions update here isn't just an addition, it's a major turning point that would reshape Clash Royale's balance and strategy in a world where the skies are empty. 2022 introduces the Mighty Miner, and in this grounded version of Clash Royale, he is an absolute menace. Even in the regular game, Mighty Miner is a strong, skill-intensive tank killer, but here he becomes even better. His single-target ramping damage makes him one of the best answers to high-health units like Giant, Golem, even Mega Knight. And the fact that he can swap lanes on command gives him a flexibility that's hard to match in a game already dominated by ground-only threats. But what really pushes him over the edge in this alternate timeline is the lack of air troops. No bats to swarm him, no minions to chip him down from above, no skeleton dragons hovering safely while dealing solid damage. All of those classic counters gone. That baked-in air vulnerability that used to balance him is completely irrelevant now. The Mighty Miner can confidently go toe-to-toe with nearly any ground tank without worrying about taking damage from angles he can't defend. In this world, he's not just viable, he is a top-tier threat. And when you combine him with solid ground control cards like Dark Prince or Valkyrie, it becomes clear. In a version of Clash Royale where the skies are silent, the Mighty Miner reigns even stronger. At the end of 2022, we got two cards, Monk and Phoenix, but of course, here in this conceptual version of Clash Royale, we would only get the Monk. This means we would completely skip over the entire Funk meta, which honestly would be for the better. Good God, that time was worse than the meta minion. Anyway, the Monk. Sure, when Monk first dropped at 4 Elixir he was strong, his ability to deflect projectiles while slowly punching his way through pushes made him an annoying and tanky presence on defense. He had great synergy with cards, and being a champion, it allows the 3-card cycle to exist in your deck. But then came the nerf to 5 Elixir, and that changed everything. Even in the real game, that extra Elixir hurt, but here it hurts even more. Why? Because without air cards, there are naturally fewer ranged attackers in the meta. Cards like Musketeer, Princess, and Archers don't see as much play when their main job, chipping down flyers, is no longer needed. And since reflecting ranged attacks is Monk's entire gimmick, a meta where fewer things to reflect makes him way less valuable. He goes from being a disruptive, low-cost card to a clunky, overpowered tank with a flashy button that won't be used nearly as much. So yeah, Monk starts off pretty strong, but in a grounded Clash Royale, his time in the spotlight is far shorter than you'd expect. When evolutions first dropped, you'd think they completely would flip the meta, especially in a world with no air cards, but this first batch actually wouldn't really change much. Evolved Firecracker would still be oppressive and annoying, just like in the real game. Her chain damage and knockback would dominate lanes even without air units. If anything, she'd be even more consistent without the disruption of flying troops. Evolved Skeletons would be crazy strong. Their fast cycle and insane DPS would shred tanks and carry defense. Without flying splashers to clear them, they'd likely become one of the most busted evolutions early on. Evolved Royal Giant, also a beast. Without minions, bats, or Inferno Dragon to stop him, he'd connect way more often, forcing bigger and more expensive counters every time he shows up at the bridge. And finally, Evolved Barbarians. Still not meta-defining, but definitely better. Without cheap air spells plus swarms to clean them up, they'd survive a lot longer and provide a bit more value. So overall, this first wave wouldn't break the game, but it would quietly reshape the meta in a world where air never took flight. And from there, things only get crazier. A few months later, we get Evolved Royal Recruits, and in a world without air cards, yeah, they'd absolutely dominate. Their spread out formation and high health already make them hard to deal with, and without flying splashers or distractions, they'd become a defensive nightmare. Next up, we're supposed to be Evolved Bats, but yeah, that's not happening here. You can't evolve what didn't exist. Evolved Archers would follow, and they'd still be solid. Without the need to shoot anything at the sky, they'd feel a bit underwhelming. Same story for a bunch of other ranged evolutions that drop later. Wizard, for instance, already struggles in normal gameplay, and evolving him doesn't really change much when he has no swarms or air units to snipe. But Evolved Zap, now that one is different. It would be a game changer. Resetting Inferno Tower, clearing swarms, and doing so with extra impact would make it a perfect tool for beatdown decks. Evolved Bomber, yeah, he'd thrive too. Uncontested splash against ground units is always valuable. And Hunter, while his base form is just a discount mini P.E.K.K.A, his evolved form could surprise us. With more consistent close-range bursts, he might actually carve out a real role in the meta. As for Evo Electro Dragon and Inferno Dragon, well, they never existed here anyway. But that is just in this version of Clash Royale. In our world, some evolutions flipped the entire game upside down. You have no idea how wild it got. Watch every single broken evolution in Clash Royale ever right here. It is one of the craziest videos we've got on the channel, and I can't wait to see you there.